So I was reading a bit of Krishnamurti and listening to a couple of his things on YouTube. And I know a lot of people struggle with Krishnamurti. And to be honest, I struggled a lot with Krishnamurti when I first came across him. But I think it's worth looking at, if we come across a particular spiritual teacher that other people think is particularly good and we struggle with them, to spend at least a moment or two and just ask ourselves why that might be. Not saying that we need to make a value judgment about whether we should or shouldn't, but it's good to be clear on how we feel and why we feel that way, because after all, this path of self-inquiry is really about developing that kind of clarity, seeing clearly what's going on inside. And of course, one of the things that Krishnamurti said was truth is a pathless land, and this has been picked up by a number of non-dual teachers and teachers that point to awakening, the Pathless Path. So that always raises a question. I mean, it's a significant quote, so it raises a question, well, is it really pathless? If it's really pathless, how can people be teaching it? What's that all about? So I thought it was worth exploring that in a little bit of detail, and this is just a reflection. So again, this is not saying this is the way it is, it's not out there to be believed, it's out there to be reflected upon. If you find it useful, of course make use of it. If not, hit the delete button or swipe. So what is first of all meant by that? Well, what's being pointed to is that in many different spheres of human activity we can learn things. This is how we're conditioned. We often don't really take the time to examine our cultural conditioning. But when you go to school, and the different models and institutions that echo that are about a kind of linear learning process. You start with the basics, then you move on to more advanced stuff, and eventually you get some sort of certificate or qualification, if you pursue things through to exam stage. And this is kind of embedded. We don't realize this stuff is embedded, but this is the way, this conditions how we see life, how we reflect on life, and how we engage with new things when we come across them. So of course, when we come across non-duality, the idea is, well, perhaps this is something I can learn as well. So what do? We go to the bookshop, we look for teachers, and we try and find out something about it. But then it gets really frustrating because we come across these phrases like, oh, it can't be taught, and it's pathless, etc., etc. There's nothing to learn, and you're already awakened, when you're thinking, well, blatantly I'm not, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here listening to you. So what is actually meant by this? Well, first of all, I think when we examine this, we have to realize that there's a massive difference between the idea of learning and knowledge, something that we can know in a conventional sense, i.e. you can study history, you can look at what happened and when, you can study science and look at the different aspects and different disciplines within science. But when it comes to non-duality, what we're talking about is realizing truth, not finding out about truth, but realizing truth. That's not the same thing, because this is based upon the idea that truth has to be just what's here right now. If the entire universe, if everything is not present here, if it's not this, then where the hell is it? Where is it hiding? It's got to be about this. It's got to be about this moment, this now, right? Well, how can you teach the present? How can you teach this moment? So this pushes us in a totally different direction. We've got to start thinking, okay, well, this isn't therefore about rote learning. This is about how we see the present moment. And this is where terms like awakening start to come into play, because what's being pointed to there is that you're not seeing the present moment clearly. And that is a pretty confusing message the first time you come across it, because on the one hand you think, do you know what, yeah, I am awake, seeing this pretty clearly, what am I missing? And that's because we're conditioned to take in this, what's going on around us. But actually what this is pointed to is not what's being received by the senses, but how it's being received. How that's being received and how it's being related to. This takes us away from the simply conventional appreciation of that's a chair, this is a table, that's a wall, to how these things are held in relationship within this consciousness. So it takes us to that second layer, and it takes us to the layer below that and the layer below that. And this again ties in when people say, well, it isn't that things are good and bad, etc., etc., try and get away from that conventional approach and look at where there is attachment, where there is aversion, how these things are actually related to, rather than simply take a rule-based approach to it. So the direction of this path suddenly goes in. It's not looking out anymore, it's looking in. We're not asking questions about who created the universe and are there aliens. At the end of the day, who cares? Why is there something rather than nothing? I don't care. I want to know why I get depressed. I want to know why I suffer. I want to know why I can't give this up or I never get enough of that. That's what I want to know. That's my life. Where it all came from, who gives a monkeys? What has that got to do with anything? And, admittedly the Buddha didn't put it quite like that, but spiritual teachers following in the same vein have kind of gently pointed us in the same direction. So I think that's where we need to point our inquiry as well. So we're looking inwardly at how this is received. Now, we gain some insights along the way as part of this inquiry. Suddenly we get a massive flash of inspiration. Oh yeah, that's why I always do this, or that's why I react in a certain way. That's why that always winds me up, or that's why I never get bothered by this. We start to see these things clearly. We look at the conditioning, the role models, the events, and the things that have helped to shape our lives so far. None of which are the point. They're nice things to have along the way. These are like the little nuggets that we unearth. But what we're really getting to is developing our looking muscles. We're developing our ability to see clearly in the moment. We're developing our ability to really apprehend this with absolute clarity. And it works a little bit like this. So if you imagine you're looking through a lens, right? If you imagine, which I guess in terms of our eyes is literally true. If we have views and opinions, and who doesn't have views and opinions? Of course we have views and opinions. The views and opinions aren't the point. The question is, do you know what they are? Do you know how they condition how you see? Because if you're aware of that, then when they condition what you see, that's part of your vista. That's part of what is observed. When you're not conscious of that, then they're part of the lens. They distort whatever's on the other side of it, or at least they have the potential to. So what we want to do is we want to make this lens absolutely free from imperfections. That's the clarity that we're after. So we have to be very self-aware of the conditioning that's present, of the views and opinions. Not to get rid of them particularly, but just to have clarity about what those are. There are certain things that I will never get rid of. I will always be a little bit insecure. I will always get easily frightened about certain things. That's part of this human experience. I don't expect it to particularly change. But as long as I'm aware of that, I'm also aware at the same time of how that has the potential to condition the way I respond in situations. That's the clarity that we're aiming for. Because when we have that clarity and situations arise, then choice is there. Choice equals freedom. And this is about freedom. If this doesn't lead to freedom, why are we doing it? Right? So this path points us in. It points us to try and be aware of the things that are going on inside, the conditioning which has led to all of this. This is kind of why nobody can teach it, because it's up to you to inquire. They can point you in certain directions, but you then have to go and do the work yourself. You then have to do the inquiry yourself. Much like if someone said, if you read this really good book on physical fitness, it'll be a massive help to you. It won't make you fitter. It'll only make you fitter if you do the exercises, right? So you have to do the work for yourself. You have to do the inquiry. But what this leads to is our ability to apprehend, to see this present moment with complete clarity. Completely clear, as it is, as it's unfolding, which, bear with me, you may not right now, okay? So that's what this is being pointed to. Now when we develop that clarity to a certain point, we can notice that thoughts arise and pass away. We notice that feelings arise and pass away. We notice that sensations arise and pass away. We notice this physical form is constantly in a process of change, as is everything around us. And when we see this change, and when we really, really get it, then it suddenly occurs to us, well, what could be fixed or permanent or separate within any of this? And at some point in that process, the notion of a separate self just falls over. It disappears. Now, for some people, that's a really dramatic kind of event. They have this massive shift and I've awakened. But for some people, it's just a very gradual slipping away. There's no right or wrong around this. It's not particularly, it has to be one thing or the other. And for some people, it happens sooner. For other people, it happens later. It's not a race. It doesn't matter. As long as you're engaged in this inquiry, the point at which the separate self, or the reality of there being a separate self, the point at which that is seen through, it's actually pretty much inevitable. It's going to happen at some point, so don't even worry about it. But that's not the end of the story, not by any means, because this inquiry has to go on, it has to evolve, it has to deepen as we see more and more of this process more clearly. So ultimately where we arrive at is just the clarity to see this present moment exactly what it is. There's no path in the present moment, it's just this, right? It's just this. So yeah, it is a pathless path.